Welcome back to Changemaker Q&A, everybody. Today's episode, we are going to be diving into a topic that I feel like I could talk about all day, every day, and that is the power of storytelling for social change. In this episode, what I really want to cover are like the key reasons that storytelling is so powerful for us as humans. I don't think I'm going to be able to get into too many like storytelling tactics or frameworks, but if that is something that you are interested in, definitely feel free to ask any specific questions for me to answer on the podcast, either by heading to the link in the episode description, or you can just ask your questions directly via YouTube or Spotify. What I really want to talk about today is the power of storytelling for us as humans and how storytelling is at the heart of everything that we do as change makers. Why are stories so powerful? Storytelling is at the heart of the human experience when you think about it. It shapes everything from how we understand the world to how we form and maintain relationships and even how we engage across the social change space. Storytelling is more than just a way to communicate with other people. It really is a way to influence our beliefs, to guide our decision making, and help us imagine new possibilities. From ancient traditions to digital media, storytelling has always been central to how we make sense of our past, navigate our present, and build the future. First of all, storytelling is a very timeless human tradition. Long before we had the written language, people have conveyed knowledge and cultural values through oral storytelling. Around fires, elders would share histories, myths, and moral lessons that were passed down from generations before. This was a way of portraying wisdom about kind of key survival information to other people. In Australia's Aboriginal cultures, Aboriginal songlines, a fascinating form of sharing knowledge through the land and a way of embodying storytelling long before the written language was invented. And visual storytelling has always played a role as well. We could see prehistoric cave paintings that depicted different hunts, rituals, or communal experiences. As societies began to evolve and shift, storytelling and our ways of storytelling also adapted. We had things like poetry, religious scriptures, theatre, and also literature. In our modern history, two big advancements were the invention of the printing press, which enabled narratives to reach a broader audience, and it fostered new ideas and social movements. Later, radio really transformed storytelling, TV as well, but I don't know. I wasn't there when either of them invented, but I imagine that radio would have been quite revolutionary as a means for people to listen to stories being told from faraway places in real time. These transformed storytelling into shared cultural experiences. It also shaped public conscience on a really massive scale. Today, we obviously have the internet and social media to further democratize storytelling, and it allows individuals right across the globe to share their perspectives in real time. I think an interesting example to put this into perspective was the role that radio played during the First World War and even the Second World War. The fact that people were able to tune in to people telling stories about what was happening all over the world and listening to news in real time. I think the next big shift that we had was around the time of the Iraq War. People could see news reporting happening in real time. People were watching things unfold online. They were seeing video footage of this happening in real time. And then I think the recent conflict with Palestine was another kind of big shift where we then saw individual people at the grassroots level documenting their struggle and sharing stories on platforms like TikTok and Instagram in real time. I think that those shifts are indicative of how our means of storytelling has changed, but our need as humans to feel connected and to want to understand what is happening in these times of crises is something that has been there all the way since World War I. So even though there's been technological shifts and the technology that we used has changed, I think that storytelling has always been humanity's most enduring means of communication, and it shapes the way we learn, the way we connect, and the way we create meaning together. Stories also help us to understand the world. I think that at their core, stories could be thought of as ways to communicate cause and effect patterns. When you think of any kind of story and like a format of story, whether it's like beginning, middle, end, you could reduce that down to a framework for cause and effect. Beginning is like the inputs, the middle is like the process, and the end is like the outputs. These are ways of translating these complex cause and effect patterns into things that our brains are more receptive to. As humans, our brains are always naturally seeking patterns, narratives, and we want frameworks to link our emotions, our experiences, and outcomes in ways that we can understand. This is why a lot of, I think, complex issues, whether they're historical, social, or scientific, always become more accessible when they are conveyed through stories. Statistics and raw data are important, and they're often valuable to illustrate the scope or depth of an issue, but they always become far more impactful when they are tied to personal narratives. As an example, you could communicate the issue of climate change through numbers quite effectively, but it's only when you hear stories of what that actually means for people that we begin to understand the urgency and the realness of the issue of climate change. Similarly, I think we use stories in our lives to make sense of things like our identities, our struggles, and our aspirations. We don't really think about ourselves as like a series of facts. We think about ourselves through the story that we tell ourselves about who we are and our identity and what that means. We also think in stories, not in facts. When we recall a past experience or we imagine the future, we don't really visualize it as like a series of facts or data. We organize our memories and we think about the possibilities of the future in narrative form. Often, for those of us who have the capacity to, we think about it like a movie playing out in our head. It's the same as making decisions in the present moment. We don't really weigh up like a list of pros and cons. Really, when we think about making a decision, we think about the possible outcomes playing out in our head. We tell ourselves these stories about what might happen if we make this particular decision. This narrative-driven way of thinking, it makes storytelling such a powerful tool for both personal transformation and for social change. If somebody has internalized a really limiting story about their past and what that means for the person that they are, maybe they believe that they're just an unlucky person, or that they're not a smart person, or that they're incapable of something, that is going to influence the actions that they take, and it's going to reinforce that belief. However, if somebody views themselves as like a lucky person or somebody who is quite resilient and capable, they are going to take action in accordance with that story that they're telling themselves about who they are. It's the same when it comes to the collective stories that we tell about the world and how the world could be. If people just accept inequality and environmental destruction as inevitable features of our society, then they're probably going to feel powerless to change them, and they're not going to see them as urgent issues that can be changed. Whereas when we tell ourselves narratives about how there have been successful social justice movements and how we can have a world without these negative things, then that is what motivates us to strive for justice and sustainability and systemic transformation. Data alone does not drive change. Stories do. At the end of the day, facts and figures, when we look at data, when we look at graphs, when we look at information, any kind of raw data, it is just abstract numbers that don't have any meaning until we ascribe a story to them and we tell ourselves what those numbers actually mean in the world. It's the human stories behind the numbers that actually make the numbers make sense. As a kind of simple example, if I was to say 1 in 3 women experience gender-based violence, 1 in 3, that means nothing. But the full weight of that actually has meaning when we think about the lived experience and what that actually means for people. When we understand the lived experience of survivors, when we understand the systemic factors that have contributed to that issue, and when we learn about the people who are working to change it, that's what gives that number meaning. Stories are what make statistics a reality. They make it real, they make it tangible, they make it mean something. We could apply this principle across different disciplines. We could apply it to science, to policy, to activism, or even business. A new discovery in science doesn't really mean anything until we can frame it in what it actually means for humanity, what that discovery actually means for the stories that we tell ourselves about the world or about that thing. Something that I've been alluding to as well is I think that the stories we tell ourselves shape the future that we create. All of the major social transformations that we've seen throughout history were fueled by stories of possibility. Abolitionists challenged systems of oppression because they told themselves and others narratives of freedom and dignity. Feminist movements reshaped social norms because they told stories of empowerment and equality. Climate activists today are crafting really compelling narratives about regeneration and ecological responsibility, and that's what's inspiring collective action. Our future is never predetermined. It's shaped by the stories that we tell ourselves about how the world is and how the world could be. So narratives have a lot of power to maintain the status quo, but also to challenge it, to reinforce it, and imagine alternatives. We have to see storytelling as more than just a communicative tool or a reflective practice. We have to see it as a force for action. If we want a more just and sustainable world, we need to be able to craft stories that are compelling enough that they're going to motivate people to take action and change. We also have to elevate narratives that are challenging dominant paradigms while offering compelling narratives of an alternative vision for the future. It's not enough to say we don't want this. We have to also tell stories of what we do want and what is possible. This could happen through books, films, journalism, digital media, the conversations that we have with our peers. These are all ways that stories can shape the realities that we bring into being. So, how is storytelling embedded in everything we do as change makers? First of all, storytelling is a part of our everyday conversations. Every conversation that we have has the potential to plant a seed for change. When we talk to people about the causes that we care about, when we tell them stories about why we care about it, when we tell them stories about the work that we do and why we do the work that we do, we're not just providing facts or figures or making logical statements. We're weaving narratives into the conversation that's going to connect us with the other people in an emotional way. When we're sharing those personal stories, those anecdotes and lived experiences, it's humanizing issues that would otherwise seem abstract or not important. People are going to be far more likely to engage with our causes if they can relate to a real person or a tangible event or experience that has happened. I've got another episode that I will link below where I talk about this idea of planting seeds in our conversations for change. So rather than trying to win a conversation or convince somebody outright that they're wrong, what we really want to be doing is thinking of these exchanges as planting seeds and just telling stories that we hope these people are going to go out into the world and they're going to water, they're going to fertilize, they're going to tend to these seeds. So if you're interested in that, check out our episode on the spectrum of allies. I will leave that one linked in the description below. We also use storytelling in marketing and movement building. Effective movements are really built on compelling narratives. So marketing, whether this is through the campaigns that we run, the branding of our organizations, or our grassroots outreach, really relies on storytelling to make issues resonate with people. A powerful story is something that can cut through all of the noise, and it can make a complex issue really understandable and motivate people to take action. Successful movements have always been accompanied by really strong storytelling, whether it was the civil rights movement to the LGBTQ movement. From the civil rights movement and the narratives that they told of injustice and resilience to climate activists today telling stories about the future that they are fighting for, all of the most impactful campaigns have been able to harness storytelling to shift public consciousness. We also use storytelling in digital media and digital storytelling, particularly social media, which has really amplified, I think, the role of storytelling in our lives. Platforms like Instagram, particularly TikTok and Twitter or X, even Facebook, they provide us with these tools to share stories in an instant. We can reach these really vast audiences and foster a sense of global solidarity for an issue. in ways that we previously haven't been able to. Digital storytelling can take on different forms. It can be personal testimonials, viral videos, interactive infographics, or even multimedia campaigns. In the digital age, I think that when it comes to effective storytelling for change, authenticity and relatability are going to be key. People are going to be drawn to content that feels real, emotionally engaging, and is human-centered. We don't want to simply broadcast a message. We want to be using social media to build communities through storytelling, and in a way that invites dialogue, encourages people to actively engage and participate in these conversations, and also offers a tangible way for people to actually take action and get involved in the movement. We also use storytelling in the way that we actually frame issues in the world of social change. So how an issue is framed is going to depend on how people perceive it, who they believe is responsible, and what solutions they consider to be viable. Storytelling then obviously plays a key role in framing issues in a way that mobilizes action. So for instance, when we frame climate change as a scientific crisis that is dominated by statistics that don't really resonate with the general public, it's not going to mobilize people to take action in the same way as framing it as a story in which communities are losing their homes, children are growing up in a world of uncertainty, we're seeing an increase in respiratory health issues, and we're destroying our natural ecosystems. This is going to evoke a much stronger emotional response from people and make them want to take action. So we have to be really intentional about the ways that we frame issues. As an example, you could look at something like education and quality education, and you could frame that in different ways. We could frame it as an issue of equality, and that's going to appeal to a particular audience of people who really value equality and equity. Or you could frame that same issue as a human rights issue, and that's going to appeal to a completely different crowd whose morality tends to be grounded in more of those rights-based deontological approaches to what is right and wrong. So we could take the same issue and frame it in different ways to appeal to more people. The whole point of social change is not to alienate people. The whole point is to bring people into our movements and bring people on board to build a better future for everybody. I might wrap up this episode by sharing an example that I love from the body of work called The Work That Reconnects by Joanna Macy. And in The Work That Reconnects, it's grounded in this idea that there are three stories of our time, or these three grand narratives that we all tell ourselves about the world. The first story is the story of business as usual. This is the story of the industrial growth society that we live in. It's this story that capitalism is inevitable and the way we can fix the world is through more. We need more innovation, more investment, more money, more growth, whatever it is, more technology. And it tells us that the world is the way it is and it's inevitable. So we have to aspire to create change or live good lives within these frames of reference. The second story is the Great Unraveling. This is the story that we see being told by a lot of activists, by a lot of climate scientists, Indigenous elders who have been talking about these issues for a couple of generations. And it's this story that the world cannot continue to function as it is and collapse is inevitable. And this is a story that kind of invokes a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear about what the future actually holds. The third story is the story of the Great Turning, and that is a story of transformation. It's the story being told that we are living in an era that, yes, is problematic. The way that we've been living is not sustainable, but we are at a point where we can choose to create a more sustainable, a more ethical, a more ecologically aligned future. And so the body of work, known as The Work That Reconnects, is very much grounded in this idea that we are going to tell ourselves this story that we are in the Great Turning and we are going to act accordingly. So have a think about which of those three stories align with the story that you tell yourself about the world. Recognize that if you're maybe telling yourself the story of business as usual or the Great Unraveling, you actually don't have to tell yourself that story. You can start to tell yourself stories that align with this kind of grand narrative that we are in the Great Turning. And once you begin to tell yourself that story, you will begin to kind of notice that your actions change and you begin to live in a way that is more in alignment with this idea that you are a part of the great turning. So I hope you found this episode valuable. I hope it gives you something to think about in terms of the power of storytelling in our lives as humans, but also in the work that we might be doing across the social change space. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to either ask me at the link in the description below, or you can ask your questions directly on Spotify or YouTube.